When Mark Carney stepped up to the podium this week and delivered his response to the latest pressure from Washington, something felt different. His tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't desperate, it was calculated, almost too calm for someone whose country just spent an entire year navigating the most aggressive trade war in decades. And that calmness, that's exactly what makes this moment worth paying attention to. Because what Carney's been doing behind the scenes over the past 10 months isn't just damage control. It's a complete repositioning of Canada's leverage heading into the most critical trade negotiation in North American history. And if you understand what he's really doing, you'll see why Washington might have seriously miscalculated this entire strategy. How this all started. Let me take you back to February 2025 because that's when everything changed. President Trump announced sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, hitting everything from lumber to steel to dairy products. This wasn't a negotiating tactic, this was a full economic assault designed to force Canada into immediate concessions. The message was clear: bend to our demands or watch your economy collapse under the weight of these duties. For most observers, it looked like Canada was cornered. After all, 75% of Canadian exports flow south across that border. When your biggest customer suddenly becomes your biggest threat, the playbook says you fold quickly and negotiate from weakness. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Just weeks after those tariffs hit, Mark Carney won the Liberal Party leadership and became Prime Minister in March 2025. He inherited a crisis that would have broken most politicians before they even settled into office. The pressure was immediate and relentless. By April, Trump expanded the tariffs to include automobiles, adding another 25% on top of existing duties. Then came aluminum and steel, sectors that employ tens of thousands of Canadians and anchor entire communities. Every week brought another escalation, another sector under attack, another round of headlines about economic catastrophe, and through it all, Carney was being tested in real time to see if he'd crack under the weight of it. The counterpunch nobody expected. This is where most people expected Canada to either surrender or try some symbolic gesture that wouldn't really hurt the United States. Carney didn't either. Instead, he authorized $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs, targeting specific American goods with surgical precision: orange juice from Florida, appliances from swing states, alcohol from key congressional districts. These weren't random choices. They were designed to create maximum political pain in places where Trump needed support. And Carney didn't stop there. He went on national television and said something that sent shockwaves through Washington. Nothing is off the table when it comes to protecting Canadian interests. That phrase might sound like standard political rhetoric, but coming from a former central banker known for careful, measured language, it signaled something else entirely. It meant Canada was prepared to escalate as far as necessary economic pain be. For the first time since this trade war began, American officials had to consider that their pressure campaign might not produce the quick capitulation they expected, and that realization started changing calculations on both sides of the border in ways that would become much clearer as the months unfolded. The move that changed everything. By August 2025, the trade war had reached a fever pitch. Trump raised tariffs to 35% on non-USMCA covered imports, effectively closing off major portions of the Canadian economy from American markets. The economic data coming out of Canada showed real pain. Industries were laying off workers, supply chains were fracturing, and business confidence was plummeting. Every economic indicator suggested Canada was losing this fight badly. And then Carney did something that confused everyone. He dropped most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Not all of them, but enough to signal a dramatic shift in strategy. Observers in Washington thought they'd finally broken him. Political opponents in Ottawa accused him of surrendering. But what actually happened was far more strategic than either side realized at the time. Carney suspended Canada's digital sales tax, a major irritant for American tech companies. He tightened border security to address American concerns about illegal crossings and fentanyl smuggling. He boosted defense spending to hit NATO targets that Trump had been demanding for years. On the surface, these looked like concessions made under duress, but here's what they actually accomplished. They removed every excuse Washington had been using to justify the trade war. Suddenly, American officials couldn't point to the digital tax or border issues or defense spending as reasons for maintaining tariffs. Carney had strategically eliminated their talking points while simultaneously reopening the door to negotiations, but crucially on terms that made Canada look like the reasonable party trying to find solutions. It was a masterclass in political judo, using your opponent's momentum against them. What's really being fought over? Now, here's the part that most coverage completely misses, and it's the key to understanding why this entire year of conflict matters so much. In July 2026, just 7 months from now, the United States, Canada, and Mexico are required to conduct a joint review of the USMCA trade agreement. This isn't some routine check-in. This review determines whether the agreement continues for another 16 years or gets thrown into renegotiation or potentially scrapped altogether. If even one country refuses to affirm the agreement during this review, it automatically expires in 2036 unless a replacement is negotiated. Trump has already signaled he wants major changes to the agreement, particularly around automotive rules of origin, forced labor provisions, and how Chinese companies use Mexico and Canada as backdoors into American markets. Everything that's happened in 2025, every tariff, every retaliation, every negotiation, has really been about positioning for this July 2026 review. Trump's entire strategy has been to weaken Canada's position so thoroughly that by the time they sit down for that review, Carney will have no choice but to accept whatever terms Washington dictates. And for most of 2025, that strategy seemed to be working. But what Trump didn't account for was that Carney wasn't trying to win the 2025 battles. He was trying to survive them while building leverage for the war that actually matters in 2026, the leverage Canada's been building. While everyone was focused on tariff headlines and trade statistics, something else was happening that barely made the news. Canada started accelerating trade diversification at a pace that caught global markets by surprise. New agreements with European partners, expanded relationships with ASEAN countries, deeper integration with Pacific trading partners. These weren't just diplomatic gestures. They represented real alternative markets for Canadian exports if the American relationship continued deteriorating. And here's why that matters more than the size of those markets suggests. In any negotiation, your leverage isn't determined by your current position. It's determined by your alternatives. If you have nowhere else to go, you'll accept terrible terms just to survive. But if you have credible options, even smaller ones, you can walk away from bad deals. Carney spent 2025 building those options. He also did something else that was brilliant in its subtlety. By dropping retaliatory tariffs and making concessions on issues like the digital tax and border security, he shifted the narrative from Canada is weak and desperate to Canada is being reasonable while Washington remains unreasonably aggressive. That perception matters enormously heading into a multilateral review process where Mexico will also have a vote. If Mexico perceives Canada as the reasonable partner and the United States as the unpredictable aggressor, that changes the entire dynamic of the 2026 negotiations. Carney wasn't just managing a bilateral relationship with Washington, he was positioning Canada as the stable, reliable partner in a three-way agreement, which gives him leverage with both the United States and Mexico. Carney's latest stand. Fast forward to December 2025, and here's where we are right now. Despite an entire year of economic pressure, despite job losses and industry pain, despite political attacks from every direction, Carney's position hasn't fundamentally changed. His latest statements maintain that Canada stands ready for negotiations, but only if they're conducted in good faith without the threat of arbitrary tariffs hanging over every discussion. He's offered a zero tariff proposal, essentially saying if Trump lifts all duties, Canada will do the same and they can start fresh. But he's not begging for it. He's not showing desperation. He's presenting it as a reasonable option that benefits both countries while making it clear Canada can live with the status quo if necessary. That's not the language of someone who's been beaten. That's the language of someone who survived the worst of the storm and knows the real battle is still ahead. And here's what makes his position stronger than it appears. Despite all the tariff escalations, approximately 85% of Canada-US trade still flows tariff-free under USMCA exemptions. The economic pain is real, but it's not catastrophic. Canada's economy adapted faster than most economists predicted. Industries found workarounds, supply chains adjusted, and while growth slowed, it didn't collapse. That resilience matters because it means Carney can walk into that July 2026 review without the desperation Trump's strategy was designed to create. Why this matters beyond trade. What we're watching here isn't just a trade dispute between neighbors. It's a fundamental test of how power works in the modern global economy. For decades, the assumption has been that size equals leverage, that bigger economies can simply impose their will on smaller ones through economic pressure. And in many cases, that's true. But this situation is revealing the limits of that approach. When you apply pressure to a partner that has options, even limited ones, and when you do it in a way that looks arbitrary and unpredictable to the rest of the world, you don't just weaken that partner. You force them to reduce their dependence on you, push them toward alternatives they might never have seriously pursued otherwise. And once those alternatives are built, they don't disappear just because you decide to ease up on the pressure. Carney's strategy has been to survive long enough to build those alternatives while maintaining Canada's position as the reasonable actor in this conflict. If he succeeds, and we're about to find out in the next 7 months whether he does, it will represent one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in North American relations in generations. Because the question at the heart of this entire conflict isn't whether Canada can survive American pressure. It's whether American pressure can still produce the outcomes Washington expects, or whether the world has changed in ways that make that old playbook obsolete. And right now, based on how Carney's positioned Canada heading into the most critical trade negotiation in decades, the answer to that question is far from certain. What happens next will determine not just the future of North American trade, but the future of how alliances, power, and leverage actually work in a world where even smaller economies have options they didn't have before.